My name is Ivo Ganchev, and I'm Adjunct Professor of Global Leadership at Beijing Union University. Today, I want to talk to you about innovation and entrepreneurship, and I want to give you a brief introduction to these two concepts. So let's get started. First, let's think about the origins of these words, innovation and entrepreneurship. So these are concepts that have existed throughout history, dating back to ancient times. But in fact, these words are things that we started using only recently. So if you look at this graph here, you can see that the word innovation only became popular in the middle of the 20th century, for instance, starting in the 1940s and onwards. The same is true for the word entrepreneurship. It only became popular again in the middle of the 20th century, and the same goes for the words entrepreneur, entrepreneurial, etc. Now, at this time, people became much more conscious that this was a process that could be studied and systematized. And it has been developing until today. So that's why we have a lot of new materials, books, and research on innovation and entrepreneurship that were published in recent years. So what is innovation? There is a process that usually starts with identifying a problem and solving it. And this is essentially the source of innovation. So at the beginning, you usually have some sort of a problem and you're trying to resolve it in a way that is sort of creative. So this is the idea stage. But then everybody has an idea. There's a famous ad on YouTube that says, "My little sister has an idea," but nothing comes out of it. Why? Because this idea usually doesn't translate into something further. So in order to push the process down the line, you have to take this idea and realize it. And this is what we call an invention. This is the stage of the process where you might come up with a new service or a new product that resolves a problem for people. And then you move on to the third stage. So an invention isn't enough. There are lots of inventive people, and sometimes they might be scientists, and they might be really clever in their fields, but they're not necessarily able to commercialize their ideas. This means to put them onto the market at a price that the consumer is willing to pay. And this is the stage that we actually call innovation. There is a quote that's frequently used in business studies which reads, "Out of 100 ideas I have, 10 are considered for further development." In the terminology that we use here, they become inventions, and out of them, one goes to the market, so only one turns into innovation. So when you think about the concept of innovation, there are different angles according to which you can approach it, and it's very different from the concept of invention as we spoke about. So innovation, if you just look at a basic dictionary definition, it's very broad. It tells you it's a new method, a new idea, a new product, or something like that, and it's really not telling you very much. Then if you look at a business dictionary, it tells you that this is the process of translating an idea or invention into a good or service that creates value or for which customers will pay. But then if you look at people that actually work in business or that engage with businesses every day, you can see slightly different perspectives and twists on this idea. So for instance, the person who founded the website idea2value.com, Nick Silicorn, talks about the customer's perspective. So in his opinion, it's the customer's perspective that you need to be thinking about when you're innovating. If you look at, for instance, David Burkus, a professor of leadership, he tells you the application of ideas that are novel and useful. Creativity, the ability to generate novel and useful ideas, the seed of innovation but unless it's applied and scaled, it's still just an idea. And then if you look at, for instance, Steven Shapiro, who's a best-selling author, he tells you that very simply put, innovation is about staying relevant. And because we're in a time of unprecedented change, this is something that we need to consider whether we're talking about established companies or new companies. So in many cases, if you want to stay relevant to the market, if you want to keep your company, you actually have to innovate constantly, because otherwise there are startups that come up and surpass you in terms of the value that they provide to customers. So when you think of inventions versus innovations, there are numerous examples throughout history of how certain inventions turned or did not turn into innovation. So for instance, the light bulb that is everywhere in everybody's house, it started as what was called the arc lamp, and it was developed initially in 1802 by Humphrey Davy. But it took almost 80 years to make it commercially practical. And it was Joseph Swan and Thomas Edison who are actually much more famous now for making it commercialized. And this is something that required a process of actually figuring out how to manufacture it, how to present it in a way that delivers value to people, and how to essentially take it to the market. The same is true for the automobile, for the car. It was first invented by Carl Benz in 1886, but it really took to the market in terms of mass production and sales when Henry Ford came up with the assembly line. Now, when you think of innovations and inventions, they're not things that just spring out of nowhere and come out on their own. They usually build on decades or sometimes hundreds of years, which includes the work of other people in that field, and which might include things from other fields. So if you think of things in your home, even like the TV, they include many different parts that came from different industries. So innovations can be broken up into endless different types, but these are some of the common ones that are used in the business studies discourse. So for instance, the first one is a breakthrough innovation. So this is something that pushes a certain product to the next level. And one of the most popular products of our generation, the iPhone, actually represents this. So when I was much younger than now, the most popular models of phones were actually flip-out ones, and they had a keyboard inside, and they looked much like a laptop. And then what happened was, when the iPhone came along, what they did was they just put a whole big screen onto the phone, and they got rid of the keyboard. And this was a breakthrough innovation. Why? Because it essentially reconceptualized what the phone should be, rather than building on something that already exists. But then you also have incremental innovations. So if you think of, for instance, other things that you're familiar with, like blades that you use to shave, Gillette did something, and it's been doing this for many, many years, which is basically increasing the number of blades on each razor that you buy. So we've moved from 1 blade to 2 blades to 3 blades, and now we have 5 and 6 blades. So these are incremental innovations. They build on the previous ones. And then you have social innovations. So these are things that are not necessarily initially oriented towards a business model or towards scalability. So they might be things that offer solutions to challenging and systemic social or environmental issues. For instance, one of the recent cases in the US when Donald Trump was running for president was he called his opponent Hillary Clinton a nasty woman. And after that, what happened was a lot of people were angry about it. So there was one woman who made a website where she started offering t-shirts that read "nasty woman" on the front. And then that actually turned into a huge business. So a couple of days later, she got lots of orders. And she called the company that was running the website, and she asked if they had some kind of an issue or if this was just some kind of wrong information, miscommunication. And in fact, it turned out that this had turned into a big business. And this was sort of a social innovation that ended up being called t-shirts that make you eat your words. And you also have business innovations, which is another type of innovations, and which actually happens when an organization introduces new processes, services, or products to affect positive change in their business. So for instance, a recent example is Amazon Prime. So what happened before on Amazon, you used to buy, for instance, a Kindle, and you used to buy ebooks, and it was more like a transaction. So you buy them on a one-off basis. And recently, they started offering services like Amazon Prime, where you subscribe and you essentially buy a service. You buy something that they keep offering to you at will whenever you need it. And this is very important because it changes the social relations between an enterprise and its users or customers. So we're moving from a transactional-based model to an interaction-based model. And now you have to actually keep the level of your service, and it has implications for the way that you manage people, the way that you structure your business, the way that you incentivize your workers, etc. And finally, we have cross-sectoral innovation, which means applying innovation from one sector to another. So innovation has many characteristics, but some of the main ones are listed here on this slide. And the first one is it has a dual nature. So first, it reflects on the processes within an organization, and also the process within an organization might reflect onto an innovation or onto, for instance, the frequency of innovations. So One of the examples that we just spoke about in the previous slide, for instance, Amazon Prime reflects on the way that Amazon is managed. So now you have to manage a team that's offering a constant level of service rather than managing a team that's developing just new good products. Or if you change the way that you manage a company, for instance, if you think of Silicon Valley companies like Google, so they offer, for example, what we call the 20% rule in the business circles, and they give 20% of the time to their engineers just to do whatever they would like to work on and to develop new projects and new ideas. And Gmail, which is their famous email service, is something that came out of this as a result. Another characteristic of innovation is the collaborative nature of innovations. It is proven through research more or less that we are more efficient and more proactive if we invent together, if we interact with others, if we work in teams. So innovation has a collaborative nature. And finally, you have to consider the cultural context and the national context of innovation. So what is innovative in one country might not necessarily be innovative in another. So in terms of promotion and marketing, for instance, long vlogs. So these are long videos that people would just record and show their lives, or just record as reflections on events, etc., were something that was popular in the West maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it only started getting into China much more recently. So before, there were shorter videos in China that were much more popular, like 10-second videos or sometimes 2 or 3 minute vlogs, and now it's much longer ones that are going into the 5-minute mark, 7-minute mark. So these are changes that are specific to certain countries or regions. Now, innovation is something that usually has a lot of doubters from the start. So for instance, when you think of even some of the most successful examples in history, like computers, there are people that doubted that they would become something that would be world-changing. So for instance, Thomas Watson, who was very respected back in the day, he was chairman of IBM, thought that there was a market for maybe 5 computers worldwide. Another example is, for instance, Western Union, which was an extremely important company historically. Obviously, it's still huge now, but before we had wire transfers, before we had instant way to transfer money to each other, Western Union was an absolutely crucial company to the world economy. And in an internal memo, we can see that they didn't have high hopes for the telephone, and they thought it had too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. They thought it wouldn't have any value to society, but, well, see what's happened in history. It's proved them wrong. When you think of the film industry, Henry Warner famously said, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" Because back in the day, in 1927, when he said that, as you perhaps know, most of the movies, well, all the movies were silent, and they were essentially accompanied by music. So it's not necessarily that the industry leaders are always able to recognize innovation. And when you think of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs are usually people that listen to feedback but don't necessarily follow what others are telling them. So what they're doing is they're taking all of that information on board in order to take an executive decision. And they might decide to go against the industry-leading opinions. And sometimes, well, as you can see from these examples, they succeed. Another crucial point when you think about innovation is whether there is know-how involved, and what type of know-how is it. So is it some type of a general skill set? So are these just the skills of the people that you're working with? Or is this some kind of know-how that can be patented? For instance, in technology or in medicine, these could be certain formulas or certain products that you can patent and get the exclusive right to produce them. You can also think about intellectual property rights. And in some industries, they're limited. So for instance, when you think about medicine, there is a conflict between the right of people to access medicine and the length of the patent for certain types of medicine. And that's why there is a limit of 20 years on some types of medicine. So another idea that's relevant to know-how is confidentiality. And businesses that deal with constant innovation are usually very much concerned about confidentiality, and it's something that they start thinking about very early. So at the beginning of a new project, they're usually very careful about the way that they communicate to people that are involved in the project, and they're very clear on who can and who cannot know about it. So innovation can be driven by many different factors, and these are some of the factors that I'm just going to go through very quickly here. One of them is the individual. So when you assign responsibility to a person or when you provide them appropriate training, that usually means that they tend to develop a drive to innovate because of that responsibility that they've taken on board. Another source of innovation can be potentially the team. If you put together a team of creative people that get along, you should also think about the personality factor, and that could essentially result into innovation. It's also the enterprise that sometimes plays a role in the process. So if you have a corporate culture of innovation, do you leave sufficient space? Do you leave sufficient freedom to your workers in order to allow them to innovate and to bring their ideas on board? Do you listen to them? Do you consider some of them? Do you take them on board every now and then? So the enterprise is another factor that could drive innovation. And then you have processes. So are you assigning R&D funding regularly? Are there certain processes for instance, examining new products and new ideas that are encouraging people to bring them to you? And you should also think about going beyond just developing products. So when you talk about innovation, it might be about the way that you're marketing products, the way that you're promoting these products, or even moving from a product into a service like the subscription model that we spoke about earlier in the lecture. Another group of drivers for innovation includes the psychological climate. Are you welcoming to new ideas? The physical environment. Have you given your team sufficient space for creativity physically? Is there a corner in the office or another room where they can go and play around with new ideas? The organizational culture. Have you actually demonstrated that for you and for your company, innovation is something important? And then finally, you also have two external factors, the economic climate and the market conditions. Do you keep funding innovation through tough times? This is something that's very important because usually market crises affect innovation very negatively, because what do companies cut off first? Well, usually it might be the fund for innovation and development, because it doesn't affect the day-to-day business operations. And finally, you should also think about geopolitical culture. And by this, I don't just mean things like the US-China trade war, but I also mean things like if you, for instance, as a Chinese student or a Chinese graduate, go and work for a multinational company, what kind of geopolitical knowledge can you bring in terms of the Chinese market? What kind of understanding of that market do you have that can benefit the company? Can you help them organize their campaign better here? Can you make them increase their sales here? And vice versa. If you're managing a big Chinese company, you're entering a new market, you're entering Latin America, you're entering Africa, you're entering developing markets, can you get people from these areas on board so they can actually tell you more about the region and the geopolitical culture there? So based on what we spoke about, you should go off and do some more of your own research, and in the process you can also think about whether you know of any famous entrepreneurs. What did they develop and why did they succeed? What are some of the famous success stories that you've heard of, and how could you potentially follow in their footsteps? Also, you can think about examples of innovation in your community. Are there any examples that you've seen personally? How did they work out? How did they succeed? And why so? So think about these questions, learn about them, and I'll see you in the next lecture.